Okay, I've been given the all clear to get started. Just a few points of housekeeping. So you know the webinar will be recorded. I've already mentioned using the chat box to engage. Please use the Q&A function as well to ask questions for our panelists. Do join us on Twitter with the hashtag #AWorldWithDrugs. So yeah. Very delighted that you're joining us today. And we've got 5 speakers with us today. One of them will be a video presentation. She actually couldn't make the discussion, but she sent in a video. Each panelist will present for about 8 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So to introduce myself, my name is Anne Fordham. I'm the Executive Director of the International Drug Policy Consortium. And I have the pleasure of welcoming you today to this final webinar in the series called A World with Drugs. IDPC has had the pleasure of co-organizing this webinar with our brilliant partners at Health Poverty Action, Transform, the Transnational Institute, Instituto RIA, Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, and the Interdisciplinary Centre for Cannabis Research. Together, we embarked on this unique series to discuss different aspects relating to legal regulation because it is no longer a vague and distant possibility. Increasingly, it is part of the mainstream discussion on drug policy reform as we build on the strong critique of repressive drug policies towards developing and designing solutions. However, one of our key concerns is that the solutions cannot simply be market-led solutions that end up privileging the interests of corporations over ensuring social justice and development and human rights outcomes. So taking that in the broadest sense, the series so far has covered a diverse range of topics with lots of lively debate. I encourage you to view the previous webinars on the Health Poverty Action YouTube channel. We've discussed corporate capture, trade justice, tax justice, sustainable livelihoods, cultural and traditional rights, and climate justice. And in this final webinar, we will focus on community participation. It is absolutely clear that sustainable social justice and ecologically sustainable reform, for that to happen, impacted communities must play a leading role in policy design and in program and service delivery. Throughout the series, we have learned that the legal regulation train is leaving the station. And in the emerging critique of unfolding legal regulation initiatives, which are largely limited to cannabis for now, there are serious concerns about how large corporations are marginalizing traditional growers and how people with criminal convictions related to cannabis are being excluded from participation in the opening legal market. So we need to push for legal regulation to address the harms that have been caused by decades of repressive policies. And we know that ensuring that the impacted communities should be front and center of these reforms, that the outcomes will be more equitable and sustainable. There's a risk of not ensuring that communities lead and are at the heart of these reforms, and that the so-called solutions will simply reinforce and repeat the structural oppression that has been embedded and entrenched by the war on drugs. In terms of drug policies, communities have often been well and truly sidelined by policymakers. The criminalization of people who use drugs and of subsistence farmers drives stigma towards them and is a genuine barrier to their meaningful participation. The issue of criminalization extends to other human rights struggles too. For example, sex work, sexual reproductive health rights, sexual orientation, and the criminalization of HIV transmission. So in today's webinar, we bring together activists from different but related movements to share experiences of community-led advocacy. In some ways, this is taking a bit of a risk as we often stick to our own lanes and silos, but there is a richness in sharing different struggles as well as successes. And this can help us in working towards building important cross-movement solidarity. In an ideal world, we would bring different activists across all the different pro-rights agendas together much more often to learn and share and build solidarity. So that's my introduction. I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker. a long-standing colleague and friend, Sharan Sharma from India HIV/AIDS Alliance. And you'll see his bio there in the link. So Charan, I'll hand over to you to talk about community-led advocacy in India for harm reduction and some of the recent very important successes that you've had this year during a global pandemic. So Charan, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Good evening and namaste to everyone from Delhi. My name is Sharan Sharma. I come from a small state called Manipur, from the northeastern part of India. So growing up, it has been a difficult one for majority of us due to the incidency and the aftermath retaliation by the uniform agencies. This has resulted in closing down to many of the outlets for many entertainment outlets like the movie hall or visiting friends, because life used to come to a standstill by around 6 to 7 p.m. and that's everyday business. And also that has limited limited our travel, our moving around in the town, meeting friends or visiting families. So difficult times, but the other issue that we came across as a youth, as someone going to school or in the colleges, and while we were growing up, the availability of the pure quality heroin wasn't abundant and very cheap. You would be surprised if I tell you the price at that point of time when I was growing up. A gram of pure quality heroin used to just cost about 200 rupees. That's merely about $2.50, and that used to last for many days. So I'm one of those youth while growing up. So in late 80s and the early 90s, there was mass arrests by the police and incarceration of drug users. And you would be surprised, or you must have already heard, that the prevalence of HIV among injecting drug users went up from 0 to about 70% in just a span of 6 months' time. And this happened because needle syringe was not available inside the jail, but fortunately, or I don't know, unfortunately, heroin was still available inside the jail, and it was really cheap. This could have been avoided had the policy and the law at the time was friendlier to drug users. I'm sure the situation must have been similar in many parts of the other countries where our peers are. To talk about today's theme, I'm actually very kind of excited. A world with drugs is very interesting, but again, this is something that everyone needs to kind of carry along with us, because a world without drugs, it is not possible. Since my childhood, though I'm nearing 50, almost 50, I would be in next maybe 2 years. I just wanted to cite an example of the context of this today's discussion on one of the festival here, particularly in India. It's called Sivaratri. Many of you might be aware of this. This is a Hindu festival celebrated in honor of God called Lord Shiva. And this festival is a mark of remembrance of overcoming darkness and ignorance in the life and in the world. And we celebrate this night offering marijuana to Lord Shiva in many forms, whether it is we smoke or whether we drink a special preparation made with milk. And we do this with our parents, with our cousins, with our elders, and the dates, it is kind of accepted. So, you know, so what I just wanted to say that the drug has been there, you know, since time immemorial during the since the time of since the time when the God used to use you know, marijuana. Now coming into the real situation over what we have gone through in India among injecting drug users before the lockdown and after the lockdown and during the lockdown, I just wanted to share you know, some of the work that what we have done and what I have also particularly done involving the state as well as the National Drug User Network and the National HIV Program. Um, Having said this, I mean, like it just didn't limit our kind of networking or our kind of you know, advocacy to lead from the front. We even extended the support to our neighboring countries where our peers are in Nepal as well as in Bangladesh. So after COVID, during the initial days of lockdown, we had already anticipated that mobility or the movement of people who use drugs would, I mean, like would be negatively impacted because of the random arrest by the police, and not only by the police, but also by local pressure groups like local student union clubs or, you know, church groups, etc. And this has led to many of our peers cutting off their supply of their choice of drugs, and more importantly, access to essential harm reduction services. Our community, who is already stigmatized and discriminated, COVID-19 added another layer, compounding the existing situation, making it more challenging. The situation constructed more barriers for our community. This has led to the death of many drug users because of overdose, because the much needed naloxone was not available when it was time to save precious life of many drug users. So when I'm talking about drug users, I'm not just talking about male injecting drug users. I would also like to add in the issues and the challenges that female drug users also faces here in India. Um, um, at the moment, we don't have any specifically designed comprehensive service for women who use drugs, but then we are attempting that in one of the site. Yeah, but that's a program, but I just wanted to highlight the issues. Women who use drugs, who are also in sex work, they do as a coping mechanism to do away with the physical abuse, the guilt, the harassment, and at the end of the day, and to get a nice good night's sleep, to forget what they have gone through. You can ask any of the sex worker who use drugs, and they would say exactly the same. I'm not making up the story. If it is helping them, why are policies and laws so concerned? Isn't that equivalent to a doctor prescribing anyone for sleeping pills or an anxiety, you know, to help their patients to have a sound sleep or to address their anxiety? I think it's more or less the same. So I think we should not be bothered much about people using drugs until and unless they don't create any problem for the public. Irrespective of lack of funding from the government, this is why what I'm talking specifically about COVID-19, where the drug using community where they were the frontline, you know, worker, the frontline runner. I would also say the frontline warrior, without fearing that they would get infected with COVID, without much knowledge. And when COVID started, like, you know, none of us have you know, detailed information about how to protect ourselves from from getting infected, but then like you know, to ensure that the services are available, the drug using community, they came in the forefront to ensure that uninterrupted services for harm reduction were provided. And COVID-19 in a way is blessing in disguise for many of us, particularly in India, and that has also had a ripple effect in states, in countries like Nepal, where take-home medication, take-home doses, what you say, were allowed, and the OST center started providing, 1 week take-home doses, and this we have been advocating for the last 8 to 9 years. I mean, like I don't understand why it took so long, and after COVID came, the government also just realized that we should start giving away take-home doses, and they have seen the benefit. We have witnesses, we have kind of evidence from the ground, and it's not just about 1 week. I mean, there are certain states in India where people also provide take-home doses for about 3 weeks. I would also rather advocate that it's provided more than 3 weeks, depending upon the need of an individual. So it's more of there is no diversion, there is no misuse of buprenorphine when take-home doses are being provided. So my experience on cost effectiveness and contributing to the economy, I just wanted to share my perspective. I've been on OST since 2000, and that helped me to come out from my drug use. I matured out of my drug use, and I was kind of, I would say, away from drugs for about 8 years till 2008. But then after 2008, I started using on and off, which is also still going on now. But then, fortunately, I have access to buprenorphine, take-home buprenorphine, and I take it regularly. This has actually helped me in attending important meetings. This has helped me in attending important conferences. This has helped me in traveling inside the country, outside the country, to meet with my peers, develop good practice guideline, developing implementation guideline for harm reduction, implementation guideline for how do we actually engage community in program implementation. So I would say it is quite effective. And I also support a small family. I support my wife as well as my son. So and like any other normal regular person, I attend office at 9 a.m. Till about 5:30 or 6. Sometimes it goes on till about 7, depending on the work. And all this is possible because I have access to buprenorphine. Had I not had access to buprenorphine, I would not have been able to do so. Or rather, in fact, I would not have been part of this webinar. Had I had not access to buprenorphine, I might have been looking for drugs, or I might have been, running around, for help from some other person. So, cost-wise,
Sharan, you have one more minute.
Yeah, thank you.
One more minute.
Yeah, cost-wise, though I'm not an expert, I can confidently share that we could save hundreds and thousands of rupees, or any other currencies, depending on where we are. People can be more productive if take-home doses are being provided. So my request, or my rather statement that I wanted to make, it is that harm reduction saved lives, and when lives are saved, community thrives. When community thrives, nation prospers. We should scale up harm reduction and end criminalization of drug users. So with this, I just wanted to end with this message that let's make this world a better place to live without harming anyone. If we can't help other, at least let's not harm each other. So yeah, thank you for your time. We should support, don't punish the community of people who use drugs. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you so much, Sharan, for that really wonderful input, and also for putting so much of yourself into your intervention and sharing, your own experience of drug use, but also what access to, buprenorphine, take-home buprenorphine basically is what it amounts to, has meant to you and meant personally for your life, and how you've been able to, engage as an activist and an advocate, which, you are incredible at. So thank you so very much for that. And just also to say that, your perspective on harm reduction and the HIV response is really critical also to this discussion we're having about drug policy reform. It was back in the early 2000s that the first kind of harm reductionists really started to engage in the drug policy debate, seeing that criminalization of people who use drugs was really undermining a sustainable harm reduction and HIV response for people who inject drugs. And I think, it's also an example of how movements expand and, take on different issues and bring different actors into the movement to work towards the same goals. And I think that intersection between HIV harm reduction and drug policy was one of the first examples of that. So really value that perspective. Okay, so I will introduce our second speaker. I'm very delighted that we have with us today Kitty Chopaka, from Thailand. Kitty is an independent cannabis activist, and also, in addition to her own activism, also works with the emerging cannabis industry here in Thailand and offers a very unique perspective on the situation. So Kitty, over to you. You have the floor.
Hi everyone, Chokwan Kitty Chopaka, or just Kitty, and I think I will try to wrap all this up in about 8 minutes, because I think one of the biggest questions that I get every day right now is, what's with the legalization of cannabis in Thailand? A lot of people have this idea that it is now legal, that you can go out on the streets, go and buy it at a 7-Eleven, and actually just use it openly. Unfortunately, that is actually not the case. Thailand has legalized medical cannabis back in February 2019, but until then and now, technically it's kind of legalized on paper. It's something that is more on the policy and the framework level right now, in terms of the actual physical part of it, or putting in the regulation. All of that hasn't been ironed out as of yet, even though they actually set themselves the ability of only 2 years to actually put in all the regulation. That would actually the 2-year mark will actually be in February 2021, which is a few months from now. I don't see anything move any more than currently is, as it is now, which is technically medical cannabis is legal. Use can be legally done, but users can actually have legal access to legal cannabis. But unfortunately, on that front, the decriminalization of cannabis here hasn't been approved or hasn't been moved. Thailand, with the legalization of cannabis, we literally jumped over the first step of the steps to legalization, which is decriminalization. We still have random roadside urine testing from either actual stops that are legal. So like we have rules and law on in terms of how roadside or random popped up urine testing can be done. But a lot of times we still have problems in our system, the systematic problem of Thailand itself, as well as corruption, that kind of make all of that a gray area in terms of which particular stops is legal, which is not, who can actually do it. A lot of people don't actually have that information, unfortunately. So if you look a certain way, you still get very stigmatized and still get the whole the problem with that we have in terms of drug users and how the authorities stigmatize against drug user here in Thailand. Even though with the legalization of cannabis, they still target the general users that are considered druggies here. But in terms of policies and how it is moving, it's getting there. One thing that I do feel is that it's actually faster than a lot than everyone actually expect. But at the same time, people seems to forget that as soon as there's cannabis within the conversation, they think that it's such a miracle thing that it's people either forget that how long it takes to change a law or how long it takes to take the public to accept the actual the cannabis itself, or whether if it's going to be for medical or recreational purposes. Just the fact of it being a plant, sometimes it's still the problem that people don't understand. So I would say that from my experience from being in this industry, from the advocacy side, the very down on the ground, talking to from growers to users, and now up to the industrial side, even though the same problem still exists with the users and the growers, even though with the legalization, I do feel that I can't do anything in terms of growing a cannabis industry here without actually paying tribute back to those that paved the way for us to actually have an industry. The users, the growers, those that has been persecuted previously, like we cannot forget them. They need to be a part of this legalization and a part of this emerging industry that is supposed to be billions of dollars. So that is kind of my thing in terms of why, even though coming into the trying to grow the industry in terms of a business, yes, I'm going to make money out of it. At the same time as that, you need to kind of understand where it got to here, and also how all of those people can play a very contribute to this in a very good way with their experience. And another thing that I do see, especially in Thailand and I would say in Asia, is that we are forgetting the whole traditional and the whole cultural aspect of cannabis and of other plant drugs. I'm talking about like opiums. I'm talking about coca. I'm talking about kratom. All of them, we totally just left it all out. As soon as it becomes illegal, we've forgotten all about it. We no longer collect strains that are local to here, even though with the legalization and with legal cultivation here, we have to import strains from overseas, even though Thailand was famous for the Thai sticks or the Thai sativas, the mothers of a lot of current strain that is in market right now. But we don't even have that legally here in Thailand. So I would say that one big thing about this whole legalization, and when you get to legalize, it comes with a whole different sets of problems. The same sets of problems that everyone was fighting before the legalization still exists. Because at the end of the day, even with legalization, if the policymakers and the participant of all the stakeholders don't understand what they are legalizing, they don't understand what it is that can be done with it, and all those knowledge of 20 or 30 years, actually more, that has been lost and gone, and everyone expect that as soon as legalization occur, you have that information right then and there in your head. That just doesn't exist. I couldn't stress enough in terms of education is key. But at the same time, I do feel that with a lot of educational materials out about drugs and legalization, whether it's cannabis or anything else, I do feel that the message is not the right message, and there's no right message to the right audience right now, because everyone is sometimes only looking at the users or looking at government as the only two stakeholders. Don't forget, there's the private sector themselves that can also contribute to a lot of policy making. And they can also at the same time help with the education, because unfortunately, I got to say that like our government sucks at educating people, like badly, especially with cannabis and what happened. Because as soon as legalization occurred, they came out with saying, nah, cannabis is no longer a drug, it's now medicine. Everyone went out and expected that cannabis is now legal because the government is saying that. So they kind of ended up creating a bigger black market cannabis black market here in Thailand as a, you know, without realizing, by doing just that. So as much as they are so scared by writing policies that are close, limiting everyone, they do silly things like that. That actually ended up affecting the actual cannabis legalization as a whole on the side. So there's all of this problem that kind of comes up. And it's going to be something that I would say very difficult to move along to recreational, because right now it's still only medical. And it's very restrictive medical. It's not like medical and you can go to the dispensary like in California and go, this is, I would like this and can I buy it? No, that doesn't exist like that here in Thailand. It's still you have to go to the hospital, you have certain sets clinics that you are only allowed to go to for cannabis medication, and the actual medicine itself is, I like to quote from, I think there was a Vice article back about last year talking about Canada. They said that the Canada's sale of cannabis kind of went down because friends don't allow friends to use government cannabis. I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, and the unfortunate thing about this whole thing is we got really good quality growers. Unfortunately, they would not be able to enter the actual legal cultivation facility themselves. And it's just all seems silly because we're reinventing the wheel all over again with all of this without consulting the guy who already made it, you know, mass market it. So it's kind of silly to see things moving so fast and so slow all at the same time. And it seems like they're all blindfolded and kind of have a goal, but it's kind of not clear because everyone seems to only understand only certain parts of cannabis, like whether it's just the industry or it's just the actual
1 minute, Kitty.
Okay. Or it's just the policies or just the users or just medical. It seems like everyone have their own perspective and have their own way of how they want to see all of this rolled out. Unfortunately, we have this habit here in Thailand, especially with governments and whatnot, is that they don't talk to each other. So we ended up with policies that doesn't really reflect the reality and doesn't seem to work because of the silliness. So I think that would sum it up right there, and I'll give the floor back to Anne.
Thanks so much, Kitty. And again, you know, so important to hear your reflections on how the situation is unfolding here in Thailand. You made such a valid point about, you know, the lack of knowledge, the need to educate, but also, you know, how some of that knowledge is, you know, with the communities who've been advocating for cannabis reform in Thailand for decades, and how they're now also not being included and be part of the discussion. And that is really crucial and really central to what we're talking about today. So I will move on to our third speaker. This is going to be the video because Shadia El-Brahimi, she's an activist for women's rights from Morocco. She's been working with women cannabis farmers in the Rif region, and she wasn't able to join us today, but she has produced a short video. So we'll hear from her. Over to you guys, Tess and Clemmy, to start the video.
Hi everybody, I'm Shadia and I'm from Morocco, and I'm happy to participate with you in this webinar and also to be part and member of this community who defend human rights. And today I'm gonna talk about the role of women in cannabis area, the area of cannabis cultivation in the region of Kutama, the reef of Morocco.
And here we talk about those following axes. First of all, the role of women in cannabis cultivation area. Then challenges facing women with a direct effect from cannabis. And our experience in supporting women and farmers in Kutama, the region of Reef of Morocco. Then the effect of legal regulation of cannabis cultivation on improving the status of women. The role of women in hemp area. Women and accumulation of tasks. Though the drug trade put men at the center of stage in the reef area, women are highly involved in the cultivation of cannabis. Although their participation differs according to the douar or village they belong to. The environment, the family structure, economical conditions of the house, and women are allocated tasks that they have gained and mastered knowledge of, mainly within and harvesting. However, in some villages, they are involved in virtually all stage of cultivation. Overall, the knowledge of the women has evolved, particularly in the douar, where cannabis has been present since the 19th. In the cultivation stage, where the women participate directly, they bring food to the workers in the fields. It is women who also look after the outside labor, as well as regular domestic tasks. Beside cultivation-related work, the women take care of safeguarding the crops, feeding, watering, and milking the animals, supplying water and wood, cleaning the home, and going to the markets. Here I want to talk also about the absence of the partial role of the men in helping in the fields, so that this task is only for women, while the men may sometimes help in the transportation or transporting agricultural crops from the field to home. That means that all of the women time is devoted to working in the field or preparing food and taking care of children at home, and therefore there is no time for her to take care for herself and develop herself. So let me tell you that she does not get her rights as a full human being because of the men's bullying. And as you know, taking care of the hemp plant for a long time can be cause of many health problems for women. The challenges facing women are directly affected by hemp. What do women currently benefit from hemp? I will say nothing, just that she can get food and clothes after selling the harvest. Women do not interfere in the sale process and do not get money to make her or to develop herself. So, university studies, learning useful professions, healthcare. Those terms do not exist in the women's dictionary or lexic in Kutama area. Women are directly affected by hemp due to the following reasons. The hard work in the field make them prevented from pursuing their studies. Girls usually drop out of studies after reaching high school, so they withdraw under parental pressure to help in the fields. The Second thing, the preoccupation with cannabis and the related work that follow prevent women and girls from developing themselves in different crafts and learning new things. Also, deprivation of private economy income. The man controls the income of cannabis and spends it as he wants, and the woman does not have the right to obtain a stable economic income to meet her needs as a woman. And thus remain under the responsibility of the men, who sometimes agree to meet her needs and sometimes refuses. Then depriving women from effective management of the political affairs in the region. The Reef region is a tribal region dominated by customs and traditions, as you know, and therefore the right to vote is granted to women, but they do not have the full decision, so that they follow what the family or the husband dictate to support one candidate without other, meaning that her participation is subject to another authority, and she don't have the decision on it. As for the effect of hemp, usually the candidate is from drug baron buying agricultural crops from the poor population. That makes them subject to wrong choices. And now I will talk about our experience in supporting women and farmers in Ketama. In the Amazigh Senhaja Association of the Reef, we have worked since the inception to support the legalization of cannabis cultivation, in addition to defending the rights of important groups in rural society through the following. First of all, supporting women's education in the rural sphere, and supporting the continuation of university studies by helping them obtain university housing and educating parents about the importance of continuing education for girls. Then creating counters within the territorial communities in cooperation with the Ministry of Education and Nationality in Tema area, providing literacy services to women, raising awareness in the scientific and religious fields. Then creating centers near to teach women handcrafts, making carpets, sewing, cooking, and making sweets. Workshops in the manufactures of canning and cosmetic from natural materials. We're supporting legal regulation of hemp. The effect of legal regulation of hemp cultivation on improving the stature of women. Our defense of legalization. The cultivation of quality continues because we are thus ensuring the benefits of all groups, including women, and we will focus on women. Why? Women are legalized, can opening small income generating projects like cooperative of natural materials extracted from al-kif or hashish or hemp, achieving also economic independence, which also means bringing workers to help in fields instead of taking full responsibility. Then cannabis tourism and the alternatives jobs opportunities it provides for women.
We're very grateful to Shadia for putting that video together for us, even though she couldn't be here with us today, and really bringing the perspectives from the women who are involved in cannabis cultivation in Morocco. I mean, it's clear that in formulating a legal framework for the market in Morocco, the women who are currently involved need to be part of shaping that market. In Morocco, it's likely that following the recent rescheduling of cannabis at the UN level by the Commission on Narcotic Drugs just 2 weeks ago, to acknowledge that for the first time that cannabis has therapeutic usefulness, the medical market all over the world will start to accelerate, but also in Morocco. And I think, you know, one of the things that Shadia was definitely alluding to is bringing the market into the legal sphere will be positive in terms of allowing those involved in the currently illegal market, particularly these women who, you know, currently labor under very oppressive conditions within the hemp and cannabis illicit market, to speak more openly about their involvement in the market and their working conditions. So that's very important. Okay, so moving on to our fourth speaker, I'm delighted to introduce Emma Campbell. Emma is a co-convener for the Alliance for Pro-Choice, and Emma will talk to us about her work in advocating for abortion rights in Northern Ireland and I'm sure beyond. So Emma, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen and if you just let me know that it's working okay. Can you see that okay? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, great.
So when I was asked to speak today, I thought about trying to think through our work in campaigning for the decriminalisation of abortion in Northern Ireland and what similarities that could have to people working in drug decriminalisation. I think people have mentioned a few of these things already, but we've always treated the decriminalisation of abortion as a foundational stone to greater equality and rights and feminism, but also the campaign has necessarily involved taking into consideration other movements, other organisations and other interests. So the rights of drug users and their consent, the rights of sex workers and their need to access free, safe and legal abortion, migrant and asylum issues where those people can seek abortions, disability rights, LGBT rights and so on. So I think something that has definitely, I've heard from everybody, is how important it is to work with other organizations that have seemingly parallel, but will always ultimately have overlapping interests. So I think some of the similar stigmas to drugs that are evident in reproductive justice are the pervasiveness of the issue. So governments and institutions and people in charge, even medical companies, like to pretend that abortion is a niche issue, or like to pretend that drug use or drug habits are somehow a niche issue. But similar to what we've been talking about today, it's common. So abortion is roughly 1 in 3 women and people who can get pregnant will have at least one abortion in their lifetime. There are safer and healthier options available to people when it's legalized. So the safety and the harm reduction around abortion has always been making legal health choices available, because otherwise there's no such thing as no abortion. There's only safe abortion and unsafe abortion. And unsafe abortion accounts for millions of deaths of women worldwide every year. So also, I think another similarity is how global forces, whether that be medical forces, pharmaceutical forces, or government forces, or the force of money coming from the far right, can influence local policy. We've seen a lot of pressure, especially from the Christian right in America, who fund anti-abortion organizations in Ireland and Northern Ireland. And I imagine that is similar for a lot of the other people working here today. Our slogan has always been free, safe, legal, local. I'm not sure how the free part would translate necessarily to drug decriminalization, but perhaps certainly with treatment options. But for us, the reason abortions have to be free at the point of use is because making someone pay for an abortion is a barrier. It creates an automatic barrier. It automatically leaves out those people without access to funds, people whose partners control their finances, people who can't travel for whatever reason. So it needs to be free to be safe. It needs to be legal to be safe, for obvious reasons, for being able to ensure that the pills that people are accessing are the right pills, to ensure that people aren't using much more harmful methods, like using sharp implements or using poisonous herbal potions, or overdoses quite often, or alcohol overdoses. And it needs to be easy to access as well. So we've witnessed, it sounds very similar to what Kitty was talking about in Thailand, where we have had a change in the law in Northern Ireland so that it's completely decriminalized. But unless you have the access supports available, and people can easily, everyone can easily access, no matter their whether they live in a city or in a rural area, no matter what their disability, no matter what their access to funds, etc. If it's not easy to access, then it's not safe, because it's only a certain type of person that can get it. And then another similarity, a bit like Chana was talking about there in the first presentation, were the opportunities of COVID. Like Chana was mentioning with take-home prescriptions, people in the abortion movement have been campaigning on telemedicine, legalizing telemedicine for abortion for well over a decade. I think it's very clear that the methods are now being used, but again, like Chana had said, when it comes to drugs, why on earth this hadn't happened before is a complete mystery with the evidence. So something I'd just like to make really clear, our relationship to the law is vitally important for what we're all here to talk about today. And we very firmly believe that all abortion laws are anti-abortion. If it was like any other health procedure, it wouldn't be in the criminal justice system at all. It's a healthcare matter and should be solely residing in the health system. And when we think about the laws and the original laws that govern abortion, who was the law written for? Why was it written? And how do we learn more about abortion? So a lot of the work that we do as an organization would be community education. So we would do workshops with women's community groups, with trade unions and men's groups, with student groups. Occasionally we've been allowed into schools. And also we just do open sessions where any member of the public can join. The benefit of COVID has seen that we have had participants globally who want to know how to use the pills and what the pills are for, because that information is so hard to find normally. We also try and impress upon people about the stigma. Where does the stigma come from? And the law around abortion that was created by the British government in 1861, and which still governs parts of Africa, which still governs parts of Australia and New Zealand, and up until last year governed the north of Ireland, was written at a time when more men were, or more women were moving into working into the factories, and women were paid less, a lot less than men at the time. And so in order to keep women out of the factories, they made it harder for women to control their fertility. So what is that about? That's about controlling people's bodies for profit making for private capitalists. Something else I think is really important to mention is about art and culture. So I've spoken about the law, and we did a lot of government lobbying. But art and culture has been very important to us in order to reach everyone. So our view is that if 1 in 3 women has at least one abortion in her lifetime, then everybody loves somebody that had an abortion. And how we talk about that, so it's not, we're not just talking to people who had abortions, and we're not just talking to people who provide abortions, but we're talking to everybody to really normalize the experience of abortion. And the best way we've found to do that is through various artistic projects. It also gives us a chance to talk about abortion in a much more nuanced way, and in a way that can come directly from the people who've experienced it. And so all of our projects are led by people who've had abortions and based on real abortion stories. Katie Gillam, who here has said she believed, Katie Gillam was originally part of the repeal movement in Ireland, along with myself. And at the start, she really wasn't so sure. She thought maybe the art was a distraction, but came to believe that it was as important as writing letters to MPs and MLAs. And I'm sure it's the same in every country where politicians may be able to change the law, but they don't want to change the law until they can make sure it won't make them unpopular. So gaining a public widespread momentum using the arts, using television, using theatre, using radio, using visual arts is really, really important. And the other reason art and culture are important is because every social movement at this point in time relies on assets in social media. So your social media only works if it's visual, if it's eye-catching, if people want to share it. And so that's not talking about policy. That's not how the normal average person sitting at home wants to share a piece necessarily. It's only geeks like us that want to share that political stuff. So in order to get your message out there, it needs to be shareable and it needs to look good.
Sorry, Emma, one more minute.
Yeah. So the abortion pills were originally used as an off-label drug by people in Brazil. And what we've tried to explain in our workshops, in our community workshops, is this is the 5 pills. We've taken photos of them. We take people through a step-by-step guide on how to take them, how to help someone who has taken them, what to say if you go to an emergency room. Up until last year, you could have been facing life in prison if you'd have been found out to take them. The amazing thing is that our campaign now has removed all criminalization of anybody using the pills, even if they don't get them from our health system, even if they order them online. And honestly, during COVID, that has saved lives. Another really, really useful tool that someone else has mentioned, the UN already, is that we had a UN inquiry which found that the state party, which was the British government, was responsible for systematic violations of rights. We managed to get the text of the CEDAW finding into the decriminalization. So we haven't just decriminalized, we've given the government positive obligations to protect abortion seekers. Finally, this is an example of the art. So we did an IKEA guide to how to take the abortion pills, which we send out everywhere. You don't need to necessarily be literate to use it. And it's the kind of thing that we've been able to share globally. And we share with other activists on abortion all around the world in our security measures. So which apps we use to tell each other about how to get the pills and how to share information. And we don't have time. We never would have had time to share this video. There's a link to this song, which was based on one woman's experience of traveling for an abortion, which became really popular. And some of the stories were actually read out in Parliament. And finally, we have loads of different ways of kind of approaching it in terms of building community, like wearing merchandise, petitions, the traditional social media, all of which, is similar to all kind of social movements, especially during COVID. So I'm happy to take any more questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Emma. And it really is striking to see the parallels between, your work around abortion rights and the work around drug policy reform. I was struck by something that you said there about, who are the laws written for, who writes the laws, and who are they trying to control? And, something that is emerging increasingly as part of the drug policy reform discussion is looking back at who decided which drugs were going to be scheduled and controlled. And, actually, even in the conversations around cannabis, it was white men in the global north drinking cognac, smoking cigars, and really taking quite a racist attitude to the substances and the plants that were used by Black and brown people in other parts of the world. So, I mean, there's so many more parallels than that, but really, really thank you for being here with us today and for sharing your work and also the art, and that's just so incredible. So I hope we're going to have enough time for some discussion at the end. So finally, I'll introduce our last speaker, last but not least, Ashish Kothari. Ashish is an activist and researcher from India, and will be giving us, I think, a broader perspective around community activism and participation. So Ashish, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Clemmy, and thanks to everybody for this opportunity. I should start by saying, you can hear me, right? Okay. I should start by saying that unlike the other four speakers, I have absolutely no experience on the topic of drugs or many of the other health issues that have been spoken about. So apologies for that. I do hope that what I say might still be relevant. Basically, the work I've been doing in the last 40 years is looking at how communities in various different forms, communities and collectives, respond to crises, either very local crises, family level crises, community level crises, or all the way up to the global crises that we're facing now. And one of the most powerful lessons emerging from these experiences with which I've been involved or which I've been helping to document and understand is the reversal of the process of alienation and atomization and individualization that development has meant all over the world. We've had a dominant form of development which has been led by the West, and it has been imposed all over the world. And it's essentially focused on materialism and financial and economic growth. And that's why, for instance, all countries in the world measure their development in terms of economic growth, except for Bhutan. And this is, we don't have the time to develop that here, but this has really meant a very serious level of the breaking of communities in many different ways and of individualization and so on. And I think part of the sort of underlying reasons for the kinds of crises that my earlier speaker friends have spoken about lies in this process over the last maybe 200-300 years or 400 years. And where communities have been able to actually, or where people have been able to respond to various different crises, it has been by either sustaining a community spirit or, in more often than that, rebuilding a community spirit. Now, I do know and I acknowledge, and I think it's very important to acknowledge that it's not as if traditional communities were all rosy and harmonious and so on. There are lots and lots of inequalities, structural inequalities, there's gender inequalities in India, casteism, racism, and many others, including the ways in which some traditional communities would look at things like drugs or sexuality or some of the other issues that people have spoken about. Nevertheless, it seems to me that if we look at the kind of resilience that has been shown, for instance, in the COVID period, it has only been where there has been the revival of some sort of community spirit or collective spirit, the spirit of solidarity, the spirit of sharing, the spirit of being able to help each other, the spirit of going out of my skin to be able to help somebody else and understand that the world is not just about me, but it's about us. If you take the African notion of Ubuntu, it's really I am because we are. It's not I am because I think or whatever the westernized notions are. So it seems to me that if we think of this, of the kind of examples of solidarity and so on that we've been seeing in, especially in the COVID period, but of course for many decades and centuries, it's built on two things. One, a very strong resistance to injustice. These could be injustices in the forms that the previous four speakers have talked about. It could be injustice in the form of what capitalist corporations do in our economic lives. It could be injustice in the form of nation state domination in our lives, and basically others dominating what we do and creating various kinds of exploitation, oppression, unsustainability. But along with resistance, also the creation of constructive alternatives. If people are hungry, if people are poor, if people are deprived, if people have the sorts of issues we've been talking about, there also needs to be the construction of or the sustenance of alternative ways of doing things. We can think of health, for instance, where across the last few decades, there's been increasing privatization of health. And it's in fact where communities have been able to reassert a community health perspective where everybody takes control over and responsibility over not just one's own, but also others' health, that we find resilience. We have many examples in India, for instance, which we've documented, where during COVID, there are communities that were able to manage completely perfectly with almost no government support, safety issues, health surveillance and not surveillance, sorry, testing, and various other things that were needed in this period, and were much more resilient than the other communities where fragmentation had taken place or where they were too dependent on the government or on corporations. Now, I think this requires five or changes in five crucial spheres of life. We call that the flower of transformation, looking at sort of five intersecting petals, so to speak. Number one, the reinvention of democracy. Who is taking decisions? Unfortunately, most people, most countries in the world have thought of democracy as being elections and nation states, whereas in fact, democracy really is about you and I taking control where we are over decision making that affects our lives. Why should a politician or a bureaucrat or a private corporation be in charge of my life and your life or our community's life? Especially basic needs, which includes health, it includes education, food, water, energy, and so on. So the radicalization of democracy, I think, is one of the most important spheres of life. The second, and that includes, by the way, law and policy. So what Emma spoke about in terms of who is deciding law, who is deciding policy, that this is very much part of that. Why should policy makers be only those who are sitting in parliaments? It's all of us who should be. And there are many examples around the world where people have asserted this in the form of autonomy, self-determination, and so on. The second crucial sphere is economic democracy, where whether it's production or it's consumption, it should be producers and consumers who are taking decisions. Again, not corporations, not governments. If it's to do with my water or my food or my community's energy or health, then it should be us where the decision making takes place. And therefore, really fundamental challenges to both capitalism and to state domination of the economy. It means open localization rather than economic globalization. It means the control by workers of work facilities. It means the control, the collective ownership of land and nature and natural resources, and many other things. The third crucial sphere is social justice, because without that, both economic and political democracy can also be repressive and oppressive. So social justice really is about the struggles for equality, the gender equality, sexuality, respect for diversity, and the rights-based movements, again, that my previous predecessor speakers have spoken about. The fourth crucial one is culture and knowledge, where unfortunately, again, because of Western modernization and increasingly because of the kind of homogenization by one religion over another, in India, for instance, right now, unfortunately, by the Hindu majority over everybody else, we find that diversity of cultures and knowledge systems is being wiped out. It's the reassertion of this diversity, the mutual respect of different faiths. You can have yours, but you must respect mine and I will respect yours. The respect of a diversity of knowledge systems, not just modern science and technology, but multiple different forms of knowledge. And in that, then changing and radically altering the kind of education system we have, the media system, in order to make sure that this kind of respect for diversity and the commons knowledge, I'm just finishing in a couple of minutes, and the knowledge commons that are so important rather than the privatization of knowledge. For instance, in drugs, in medicines, it is the pharmaceutical industry that is increasingly privatizing both healthcare and medicines, whereas in fact, these are things that must be in the common domains, as has been the case for thousands of years. And finally, and I think probably at the moment, the most important, rebuilding our relationship with the rest of nature, with Earth, because we've seen with COVID, what a huge gap or chasm we have created between ourselves and the rest of the Earth, as if we don't depend on Earth for our life, as if oxygen, for instance, is no longer important. And I think COVID has given us a number of opportunities to re-examine what is the human project on Earth. What does it mean for human beings to be happy, satisfied, have well-being, have good relationships, not just with each other, but also with other species, with the rest of nature. And it's this sort of 8-month interregnum we had with COVID, which has given us this incredible opportunity to rethink this and to see what changes, what transformations do we need to rebuild a harmonious relationship with the rest of Earth, and not to think of human beings as the sort of pinnacle of evolution, but as one out of maybe 50 million species, and therefore to treat the rest of the Earth with the same respect that you and I might want to treat each other. So including things like the rights of nature, etc. Last point is that I think if we take all of these into account, and we see the hundreds of examples, maybe thousands of examples of community resilience and revival in these last few months, and many more before that, I think if we are pushing governments, if we're pushing for recovery packages from COVID, it needs to be not business as usual, not bailing out banks and corporations and so on, and aviation industry and so on, not even just the Green New Deal, but I would say a Rainbow New Deal, a rainbow revolution, which integrates all of these different aspects of justice and sustainability, and is not focused on only one or two things. And that I think would, and that is based on the fundamental values of solidarity, of compassion, of diversity, of love, of respect, of dignity, which I think we need to revive significantly in our lives if we want the world to be a much better place. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ashish. And yeah, I think I could listen to you talk for much, much longer, and really speaking so many important truths, and really about, yeah, how we return to love, to dignity, to mutual respect, and to ourselves, I think, in a way, to make the world a better place. So yeah, so much to reflect on and so rich. So thank you for being here with us today. And your lack of experience on drugs and drug policy or sexual reproductive rights, yeah, doesn't feature in terms of your contribution at all. So if everyone could switch their videos back on, we have just around 15 minutes. I'm sorry that I wasn't good enough to protect the 25 minutes, but you all had such great contributions to give. And I think I'll launch straight into the initial follow-up questions that we had planned, because we don't have that many questions from the floor. And I'll direct these to some of you in turn. So the first question, I mean, really any of you can answer this, but I think maybe Sharan and Emma can speak to this, and you've already mentioned it a little, but how have you been able to leverage the current COVID pandemic and associated crisis to kind of further your cause, especially perhaps with regard to a newfound understanding and respect of science and health? And maybe in general, you know, maybe for all of you, where do we find ourselves in the year of COVID as activists? So yeah, if you could just limit your answers to a couple of minutes, that would be great. Who wants to go first?
I'll let Charan go first.
Yes,
Okay, Sharan.
yeah, okay, I can go first. Thank you, Anne. What is actually really important for us, and when we talk about us, it is the larger community. And if we again divide it into smaller subgroups, the community of people who use drugs. And when I say community of people who use drugs, it's not just limited to a group of people who use drugs, but then what we have also seen and what we have also realized during the COVID pandemic is a lot of other community members from the transgender community, from MSM community, from other groups of people who we think that was not into drugs, but then like they have actually come out, and we have realized that there are a lot of many more community that is actually been, you know, having issues with drug dependency, and people just don't know where to go and seek for help. That's the one of the biggest hurdles that I would say. And the other thing is about saving lives of people who use drugs. And if we connect this to science, yes, it is. The medication is available, and it's available, and it's really, really cheap. It costs just about 80 rupees. That's about $1 and some cent if you translate that into dollar. But then if the government have to take this up, if the government is willing to take it up, and if government orders this medication, the price would drastically come down. And I'm sure about this because I have learned this from the buprenorphine program, because I have been involved right from the beginning, and I had the opportunity of working with the national program. The medication that used to cost about 126 rupees per tablet of 2 milligram, when we were buying from the donor money that was funded by DFID at that point of time, came down just to about 32 rupees. I believe now it has further gone down. So for saving life, if you just have to spend $1, what's the issue? What's the problem there? I mean, like, we spend a lot of money on law enforcement. We spend a lot of money on defense. We spend a lot of money on other science. That's like exploring outside the earth, what is there. But then, like, at least let us start addressing the need of the human being first, and we can start exploring what is outside human lives. So one point that I wanted to share, but then I actually missed out during my session, is the overdose management, which is a peer-led overdose management, which was actually started in Manipur again, where I come from. It started way back in 2004. Now we have done that with support from Alliance India to about 14 state drug user forum. We have distributed this naloxone during the COVID time, and many of the state drug user forum were able to save many lives. So the National AIDS Control Organization, or the National AIDS Control Program, is seriously considering to include this as a part of the national program intervention, to be part of the package that is being provided, like needle syringe program or OST or condoms or IC. So we would be seeing this very soon, because they have been engaging us on how do we actually use this. And we don't have to wait for an ambulance, or we don't have to wait for a nurse or a doctor to administer naloxone when somebody is dying. It just a peer educator or a peer can just do it, and doing that timely, it saves life. When someone's life is saved, like that person could be head of a family dependent by many. It could be his spouse, it could be his wife, it could be his partner with children. So if they lose that person, then then people tend to take up any other measures to actually support the family. So science is available. We just need to connect to the community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's a really great example, and I really appreciate you raising the progress on naloxone as well, because that is so important also. I think, Emma, you wanted to come in also on this question.
Yeah, I think there's two main points. One is about the World Health Organization, and the other is about how the underground, which I'll come back to, the underground network of activists who we were all working illegally or extra legally or above around the law for decades. But in actual fact, because we tried to keep data, especially with one of the biggest NGOs that was providing the pills illegally into Northern Ireland and Ireland, and we did some joint research with them, and the safety, the efficacy, the user experience of online abortion pills for people proved so effective that the evidence from what we were doing illegally has fed in to other countries where there was already legal abortion, but maybe 50 years old law. to suddenly deciding to be able to provide telemedicine in countries where activists had been pushing for this for years in an already legalized environment. But it was actually the work of the activists providing the underground illegal version of the pills online that was able to push for that because of COVID, because people could, it was better not to go to hospitals, because it's better not to go. And then the other side of that, which kind of feeds in, is the World Health Organization. So we would often be pushing for people to listen to the evidence of the World Health Organization. And even though we sometimes find them a bit slow and frustrating, the reason we find them slow and frustrating is because they wait for huge bodies of evidence before they change their protocols on anything. But in March, no, not March, in January before COVID, so January this year, they had already published that you could take the abortion pills up to 13 weeks, again, based on underground activist evidence that we'd built up globally and in partnership with each other over a decade's use of off-label and telemedicine. So I think both of those things in tandem proved really useful and really kind of pivotal during COVID.
Thanks, Emma. And it's amazing, I think, under COVID and the pandemic, how many things, have been done and have been implemented that we were previously told simply would never be possible, like, reducing the number of people taking flights and, for environmental purposes or whatever, that was never considered a possibility. And here we are, and it's been done, of course, at great economic cost, but it is possible for governments to do the right thing if necessary. I wanted to ask a question to Ashish, to follow up on your intervention about greater solidarity and reframing democracy. I mean, part of this series has been about bringing a broad range of voices together in a conversation about the legal regulation of drugs. And going forward, how do you think we can ensure more opportunities to bring together, all stakeholders from, different sides of this conversation to further a social justice and pro-rights reform to the drugs issue, but I guess, it could be applied to other issue areas too.
Sure, yes. One quick comment on the COVID thing before I get to that is that I think the COVID period, at least for us here in India and maybe many other parts of the world, has seen two very contrasting directions. One is increasing authoritarianism and surveillance, excuse for surveillance by states, many nation states on citizens, and of course increasing profit making by the private sector, especially multinationals. We've seen, I think, $600 billion profits being made by a handful of billionaires in these last few months. But on the other hand, we've also seen the kind of examples that others have already given, many examples of where communities are kind of realizing that they have to be relatively self-reliant on, at least on basic needs. Now in India, for instance, millions of workers have gone back from cities and industrial areas to their villages because they don't have jobs anymore. And they don't necessarily want to come back into the cities because they're leading lives of extreme indignity and so on. So are there options in the villages to create dignified livelihoods, which could then enable them to stay back and be with their families rather than have to migrate out, forcibly migrate out. So I think these are, and there are many examples of that coming up, which are very interesting. And we're trying to network a lot of these across the country and then through the global tapestry of alternatives globally, so that the experience could be used to actually create these conditions on the ground for people to be able to build dignified livelihoods out of this crisis. On the issue of, on the question you raised, I think to me, the single most important way of doing this is to set up forums of dialogue, dialogue which is fear-free and where people can actually be able to engage in to say what they feel, to bring their experience to the table or the floor, as it might be, and especially those who are most marginalized, those who have been marginalized by any of the policies or the way in which the system works, to be able to, and that's, I think, a crucial role that people like us have, because we have the privileges of being able to be on webinars like this, but there are tens of millions who don't have it. How do we enable their voices to be in the decision-making processes, right from where they are to governments and United Nations and so on. And we've done that a lot in the conservation field and in the environmental field. I think we need to do that in all the fields. And the second very important part of this is, as you said, I think building the dialogues across sectors. Now we find that, for instance, even those who are on the cutting edge working on health issues are not necessarily talking to those who are working on agriculture, who are not necessarily talking to those who are in, say, gender justice or sexuality justice. And so creating the platforms where these sorts of intersectional dialogues can take place, I think is one of the, and that's why I think this webinar is probably useful, very useful, certainly for me, because I learned a lot from the other four speakers. I think we need many more of these where, I never thought, when Clemmy called me up, I said, drugs, no, listen, that's not my subject, but she convinced me and I'm glad she did. I don't know whether the other four found anything I said useful or not, but I think it's really these sorts of platforms, even amongst ourselves. I mean, we're not even talking about the ones who are exploiting us, but even amongst ourselves, that doesn't happen often enough. If we can do that, we become more powerful internally to be able to then create the macro change that we need. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ashish, and 100% agree with everything that you've said. And I think, we need to find more spaces, particularly across those of us who are working in this sort of pro-rights movement on, different but intersecting and parallel agendas, to come together and share knowledge and have these conversations and build solidarity, and especially increasingly as our conversations become, broader and around systems change, questioning structures of oppression more broadly that intersect as well. So thank you so much. So the last word is really for Kitty, and I have a question for you, Kitty. From your experience, which is incredibly rich, what advice do you think would you give to communities and civil society who are advocating for legal regulation in the interests of people and planet?
Oh, that's a difficult one. You're kind of almost like giving me like one of those pageant question, like answer within like 60 seconds how to create wealth.
You do have about 60 seconds, and you will get a crown at the end.
I would say that it takes a lot of understanding. What Ashish actually said is actually very true. It takes a lot of listening before speaking. It takes a lot of like just being in that space, going there, seeing it physically, talk to the people, and not just through either a screen or just in books. Unfortunately, COVID is kind of not really helping on that front, because I do feel that actual human connection is the key. Without having like, I find that it's like this, we're doing when we're doing webinars or we're doing workshops or whatnot, when it's not in a physical space, you realize that the message that you're trying to get across just seems to be a bit more dry, and it's not as, you don't get the human touch or the human connection or that care through there. So I do hope that the vaccine will just get out. People are all better. We can go back to traveling and going back to those people, and bring that back out for the world to see. Because a lot of times people just don't realize, because everyone's living in their own bubbles. And this is not just about drugs or just about, it's about everything. Everyone seems to be living in their own bubbles right now, and without them seeing what's really going on, also with understanding and like acceptance that this exists, and then where do we go from there? Because I do find that a lot of problems that we have, especially with drugs here, or stigma relating to drugs here, are because also sex workers as well, and and all the other problems that is considered illegal here, is that they just hide it under a rug. They don't want to see the problem. The problem is not something that you want to, they don't want to see it. They don't want to see it exist. It doesn't exist. And without that validation that all those things doesn't exist, it just kind of invalidate all those people that is trying to fight for it, trying to fight for understanding, even before the rights itself. Because right now it's like fighting to talk. How do we talk, and how do we get out there and make sure that our voice is actually heard? And it's not just us, because with each of us that are advocating for all the things that we believe that is right, there's about hundreds and thousands more that is behind us that couldn't talk or doesn't have the voice. And we are the one who's now up in front that ended up having to speak for all. And I do feel that, I think there was one of those questions that you posted up was about how the personal, the self-sacrifice or all of that, it just comes with it. And when you're so deep in it, it doesn't feel like it's a self-sacrifice. It's one of those things that I just want to see happen, because at the same time, all of this, at the end of the day, I'm still a human. I'm still very selfish. It's not just me that I want to be able to use without persecution. I also want my child, my children, like my daughter and my son, to be able to use cannabis or whatever drugs that they see fit when they are adult, if they are able to control it, without any stigma. It doesn't actually matter. It's all down to knowing your rights. And then don't forget, there's the whole knowing, understanding, and then there's the consent part. So if you're old enough, you're able to think for yourself, and you're able to consent in all the things that you do, then why does it bloody matter?
Yes, thanks so much, Kitty, and important points to end on around informed consent. But also you touched on a little bit there, which was, if we'd had more time, I would have asked you also to speak about, the fact that in certain criminalized spaces, as an activist, as someone who is speaking out as directly impacted, admitting to drug use yourself in a very repressive environment, you are taking great personal risk. And I think, we also have to acknowledge that, and that is a different kind of activism when you're coming with lived experience from a criminalized perspective. And I think, you are doing that in Thailand, and we know that the risks that come with that. So we are over time, so I'm going to have to bring this wonderful conversation to a close. It's been so great to have all of you in this discussion today. It's really been a privilege for me to be listening to you and to be part of the conversation. So thank you all so much. I'm going to say just a few words to conclude, as this has been the last webinar of the series. And I'm a bit sad, actually, because the discussions have been so engaging and so rich. And we've learned so much from all the different speakers that we've had from so many different perspectives. I think what's clear from, before we even started our series, and as I mentioned in the beginning, legal regulation, the question is not anymore about whether it's going to happen, but really about when. And also what we have been focused on is discussing the how. Also, I wanted to say that a big part of the impetus of this series was an invitation really to the development community. Firstly, to openly acknowledge the disastrous impact of punitive drug policies on human rights and development outcomes, but also to join with us in helping to shape and guide the reforms. And we see that with the increasing trends towards legal regulation of cannabis in particular. We hope other substances will follow. The political taboo of discussing legal regulation is steadily being eroded. And really now we're at this critical moment. Now is the time to have, first of all, a serious rethink about how legal regulation intersects with many of the pressing development outcomes that we care deeply about, that we've also talked about today: reducing inequality, sustainable livelihoods, peaceful and just societies. We talked about in previous webinars, trade justice, tax justice, and climate justice. And the discussions that we've had over the last few months have shown that we have to pay attention as drug policy reformers, get out of our silos and talk to people who work in fair trade, in the agricultural sector, in labor rights. We didn't see them specifically as relating to drugs before, but they are very relevant in a conversation about legal regulation. So, I think to pick up also on what Ashish has said, we need to think more broadly and more intersectionally and continue to invite other advocates and activists into this space and to learn and to hear from them. To go back to the development community, my last point, this series has really been a strong call to you to take action. We want help to destigmatize the issue of drugs from a development perspective. And so we wanted to help do that as part of this series, reduce the perceived political risk of development actors coming out in favor of drug policy reform. I think that at this stage now, with all of the evidence on the table, inaction is no longer a tenable option, and turning away from these questions with so much harm about the evidence of the war on drugs is tantamount to complicity. So, we really want to continue that conversation with development actors and the development sector, but also even more broadly than that, which I think we've been talking about today. And we've learned through the series that, the collective expertise and experience of the field can be brought to bear, very much guided by the lived experience of those on the front line. So it's been really wonderful to share that with you. The report of this series will be due out, I think, in March. We've just been discussing in the background between all the co-organizers that, we should really continue this series. There's so many more issues that we haven't talked about. We haven't discussed racial justice, actually, specifically. We haven't talked about health in great detail, conflict, organized crime. And I think we would welcome ideas from many of you for additional topics to intersect with this issue of legal regulation. I think in the chat you will have seen we also have 2 ways in which you, as those watching this webinar, either live or the recording, can participate further in these conversations through an online whiteboard or I think an interactive globe, as you see there. And keep the conversation going, even though the webinar has been, the webinar series is currently over. So really a huge thank you to all of the speakers today and to everyone who's brought this series together. Particular thanks to Clemmy and Tess from Health Poverty Action for their vision and their support and guidance in making this such an incredible series. And I feel really inspired by the conversation today. So thank you so much to all of you. With that, I'll bring it to a close. And yeah, thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Clemmy.
Thank you, Sharan. Thank you, Emma, Kitty, Ashish. Really.